Hello everybody and welcome to our series of online webinars hosted by our friends, experts, winemakers and our sommeliers at 67 Pall Mall. We have a full itinerary extending right to the end of June and into July with some really exciting webinars lined up to keep you motivated, hydrated and maybe a bit inebriated. Tomorrow Richard Hemming will be with winemaker Nicholas Peterkin, who's making wine in Margaret River for LAS Wines, and then more from Margaret River with the amazing Vanya Cullen, who will be discussing biodynamic and carbon negative wines. Then our friend Tim Atkin MW will be talking about the great wines of Argentina. And finally, Emmanuel Cruz will be talking about the expression of a decade from Chateau d'Issan, years 2000 to 2010, along with Jane Anson. But now we're very pleased to welcome back Mr. Demetri Walters MW, who will be doing a presentation about port and their wines. So please chat away at the side on the chat box. Please share with us what you're drinking, where you're drinking it from. Please set to all panelists and attendees. And also, please, if you can, share on social media with hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end so you can ask questions. Please do write your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, please. So we hope you have a bottle of port ready at hand. Ray O'Brien almost certainly does. And over to you, Demetri.
Thank you. Let me.
Thanks.
Shall I go full screen now, Ronan?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Your Madeira one was very popular, so it's great to have you back.
Welcome all, and thank you for having me back. I'm glad the first one wasn't a complete disaster, but who knows what happened after 6 Madeiras. Maybe it was a disaster, you just didn't notice. Anyway, we have 6 more fortified wines tonight. We have vintage port. I don't know if there's a sort of subtitle here in terms of what vintage port title we have from Ronan, but we're tasting some spectacular wines. We're tasting from 1980 back to 1963. And unlike the Madeira tasting, I'm not trying to cover an entire country's wine production in 1 hour. This is purely about vintage port. But before we start, times are not great at the moment. I think we're all feeling a little bit fed up, and there's no real end in sight quite yet. So a glass of wine with you. Let's fortify ourselves a little bit first before we get into the L'Oreal science bit, which is the early slides. Ooh. God, that's good. It's a shame the bottles are so small, isn't it? I'm going to take you through a number of slides just to explain what vintage port is about. If there's anything I haven't explained clearly, please ask me in the Q&A column at the end. And welcome to everyone, wherever you're watching from, hopefully all around the world. And those of you who've got the tasting samples, lucky you, they've come in these beautiful little bottles. Quite spectacular. They look like miniature tawny port bottles. This is the view from Quinta dos Malveiros, the wonderful lodge, the wonderful homestead, if you will, of Graham's Port, and their winery is very close by. This is looking down on the Douro, quite a spectacular view, and something about the southern states about it. It reminds me very much of going down to places like Georgia in terms of the architecture and the slightly languid feel, at least in the foreground. When you go out into the Douro and you look around you, it's unashamedly arid, really quite Mediterranean in style. Let me show you some slides. Where are we? I'm just going to show you with my blinky. Just to the east of Ribera del Duero.
Sorry, Demetri, we're not actually seeing your presentation, I don't think.
Oh, what's happened? Shall I stop and start again? Stop share. I'll start share screen.
Oh no, sorry, we can see it now, so we can see it. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah? All right. It could be the Wi-Fi on my end. It's pedal power, I think. So just to the east of Ribera del Duero in Spain, just here is where the Duero rises, and it winds its way through Ribera, which is a high massif, down into Rueda, through Toro, and then it enters Portugal. And this northern part of Portugal, the great majority of it in terms of viticulture is the Douro. And there's a subzone that comes down into the Douro, Vinho Verde. Let's do a close-up. What people don't realize is the Douro, or the Douro, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is the largest mountain vineyard on the planet. It ranges between something like 350 and 600 meters for the great part, with vineyards up to about 800. It's 26,000 hectares of land available to port wine production, and upwards of 35,000 for total wine production. And it's the total wine production, in terms of light wines as they're called, that are gaining some traction. But we'll get onto that towards the end. So as you enter from Spain, you come in, here's the Duero, becomes the Douro. You go through the Douro Superior. This is the emptier part of the Douro, with fewer quintas, fewer wineries. The main body of the high quality wineries is here in the Cima Corgo. And there are still some good ones down in the Baixo Corgo. And then you wind your way down to Porto and Villanova de Gaia. Those of you who've been will know that the main viticultural influence here is this dirty great river. At some point in the past, over the course of decades, it was barraged and turned into a much larger but slower flowing river, which meant that transporting on the river became nigh on impossible. Now, many of you, if you're like me, have a strange sense of humor. And when you're somewhere beautiful, particularly doing something that only you can do, whatever time of the day that is, you might take a photograph out of the bathroom window. And so this is indeed a loo with a view, looking from the house at Malvedos down towards the winery and the settlement around Malvedos. What a beautiful view. When you think of the Douro, you think of something unabatingly hot, but actually quite a lot of the year, it looks like this. Look at these rain clouds. But viticulture here is quite precipitous, it's quite steep. As with any tasting, particularly if I'm doing it, it's got to have some history, and port has plenty. So where does it come from? Well, port originates from the 17th century trade between England and the Portuguese. It was made formal by the Treaty of Methuen. Remember, from something like 1693, I think it was, till about 1815, we were at war with France for almost the entire period, bar about 15 years, which meant that getting hold of French wine was a fairly unreliable prospect. And so finding wines that were palatable to the English, to the British, meant looking around. And so these wines came about as a result of trade wars between England and France. And the Treaty of Methuen in 1703, at the beginning of the War of the Spanish Succession, formalized a trade treaty between England and Portugal, making imports virtually neutral in terms of duty. Various merchants looked around Portugal, looking for something that was suited to the English palate. They found initially, so we understand, that Vinho Verde was considered, but of course it was something very, very different. Very high in acidity, low in alcohol, very thin, astringent, delicious, but not what they were looking for. They traveled inland into the highlands of the Douro, and they found these strong red wines. At the early part of the trade, these were wines that were unfortified. They hadn't had any spirit added to them to stabilize them. But a measure of brandy was added to them to make them, I suppose, more stable in terms of transit, not just to England, but downriver from the various quintas in the Douro, but also going into the hulls of ships, going down into the orlop deck of various ships, being slopped around and taken on fairly long sea voyages. They needed to be stable against the ravages of oxygen and microbial attack. And that's what adding brandy did. Not aged brandy, but just grape spirit. The relationship, as a result of this newfound desire to sell wine and the English merchants' desire to buy this wine, paved the way for something very, very strong in our affections. And a number of port houses, not least Kopke, I think founded in 1632, so long before this period, and Wars, founded in 1670, established a very, very long track record, a strong relationship between English and Portuguese merchants. And this has remained ever since. And if you talk to a number of port merchants, port families, such as the Symingtons, they are Anglo-Portuguese. They're married into the society of Portugal. But something that explains what port is all about is the passion that people feel for port. Not just because it's high octane, but that helps. So Percy Croft, you may know this story. Percy Croft, from the great porthouse Croft, famously said, "Any time not spent drinking port is a waste of time." And I imagine he slept as little as possible and spent as much time at the bottle in his cups as he possibly could. I would say that's a fairly dangerous motto, but something that rings true with me to a degree. So port wine has many long traditions. See these guys standing in the Lagar? I don't know what the ones at the end are doing. This guy is sort of semi-given up. He's completely given up. He's really given up. The rest of them are still holding it together. But they're treading the grapes, trying to extract as much flavor, color, tannin as possible. That still exists. That's not the predominant way of pressing grapes or extracting all those various compounds that you desire in port. But it still exists. This, though, this barca, carrying barrels of port from the upper Douro, whether it's from the Douro Superior, the Cima Corgo, the Baixa Corgo downriver, running the rapids, risking overturning the boat. These barca are a thing of the past. Actually, they can't even get down the river now because of its dams. These are some of the main grape varieties. There are many more, such as Tintacao and Suzao, which add finesse, acidity, tannin, flavor to the final blend, because port is a blended wine. These are obviously for red port, and those of you who are white port fans, in a moment I'll tell you a little bit about that. Touriga Nacional is almost always the backbone of any blend. Tinta Barroca has similar capacities to Touriga in terms of its tannic capacity and acidity. The thing about Touriga that you generally pick up on is also its flavor of licorice. Look at the leaves, though, of these various vines. They're all quite different. When you look at Tinto Roriz, which for some wine producers is actually losing ground, this is Tempranillo in Spain, Tinto Roriz in Portugal. This is a grape that is heavily palmated. Can you see these divides, these slits in the leaves? Whereas Touriga Franca, which has rather more grip and tannin, is something very different altogether. Now, my Greek mother would love to make dolmades from a leaf like that, but perhaps not from that one. White port is made from Gouveio Verdelho, but not the Verdelho that I was talking about from Madeira. It's also linked to Godello in Spain. Malvasia is also a very important white port grape, as is Rabigato, Viosinho. But white port is perhaps not what it used to be in terms of our affections for it. It can be very, very good, particularly as a very serious Collietto, single vintage, tawny style white port. It's the red port, though, that we're concerned with today, chiefly Touriga Nacional, deeply colored, firm, fruity, very small berries. Touriga Francese, lighter, rounder, not quite so aggressive. Tinto Roriz, Tempranillo in Spain, structured, fresh, fruity, strawberry flavored. Many people are very, very fond of it. However, some port houses are shying away from it. It doesn't fare as well in the port blend as the others. and hasn't been around as long as the others. Tinta Barroca, highly colored, add structure, the grapes produce a lot of sugar. Tinta Cao, a very high quality grape, quite rare and producing very, very low yields, which in years gone by, when perhaps volume was impressed upon what the farmer was trying to create, Tinta Cao didn't come up with the goods. So in total, about 26,000 hectares of land are permitted for port wine production. These are what you mostly see, traditional Douro patamares. These are the earthen banks that you see. Now, these are cheaper to put together, cheaper to maintain. They have no real structure when they're earthen anyway, and you can remake them. The Douro has an extreme Mediterranean style climate. It doesn't rain for several months of the year. However, when it does, it rains heavily, and earth banks are likely to collapse. But they're cheap to repair, but a lot of work. This is what you see more of nowadays. This is, I think, at Quinta de la Rosa. This is a modern Douro Socalcos. There are also dry stone equivalents, which are still very common. But look at this. This has been cemented. This has been given drainage channels through the walls. This, hopefully, won't fall down. It even has parapets and steps. This is something writ much more permanently in the landscape, but is expensive to produce. And here, we're in a land of smallholders. So they can't necessarily afford to do it and to then make a profit from selling their grapes to one of the major producers. This is rather charming, isn't it? I'll get onto this a bit later, because one of the biggest problems in the Douro, one of the biggest changes over the last 30, 40, 50 years has been the difficulty in getting hold of labor, reliable labor, when you want it, whether it's at pruning, at harvest, or various works that go on in the vineyard. But one thing you find in the Douro is you're never far from music, whether it's in the vineyard, with this chap here with his squeeze box, or when you're pressing grapes in the quinta. So port, it's a fortified wine. Those of you who saw my talk on Madeira will know what fortification is about. But in brief, fortification before the fermentation, or before the fermentation is completed, rather, stops the activity of the yeast from fermenting all the sugar. So you end up with a wine that is sweet. If you pour fortifying spirit, grape spirit, brandy, let's call it, into the fermenting must, it stops the fermentation immediately. If, let's say, you're in Jerez making sherry, and you take a dry still wine and you add fortification spirit to it, you can create the right environment for the creation of the floor yeast to microbially change the wine, to create those lovely biscuity flavors. If you're producing port or Madeira or other fortified sweet wines, you're effectively starting the natural fermentation and you're adding grape spirit at the point that you want in order to create the right level of alcohol, extract, tannin, and residual sugar, because you arrest the fermentation immediately. A little bit more about that later. But the fortification process is credited to a Liverpool wine merchant back in the late 17th century during the reign of Charles II, 1678, whose sons, when they were on a visit to Portugal, probably looking for alternative wines, came across the Abbey of Lamego, and they saw the abbot and his people, his monks, adding spirit to the wine and creating something both stable and sweet. This killed off all the active yeasts and bacteria, ceased fermentation, and produced a sweet, alcoholic red wine that went on to become port. As far as I'm aware, port was not universally, but quite commonly fortified by about 1712, 1715. Any Symingtons watching, please correct me. So what do you do? what are you doing with port that is different from other wines? Firstly, all port is a full-bodied wine designed, compared to other wines, to age. Even ruby port, even fairly junior tawnies, reserve ports, crusted, LBVs, and certainly vintage, they need a lot of color, tannin, body. They have acidity because those grapes have them. And these are designed to imbue the wine with longevity. So you have to have rapid extraction, and we'll talk about that in a mo. So during the early stages of extracting, whether it's robotically or with human feet, you're looking for rapid and optimum extraction. At about 5 or 6 degrees of natural alcohol, because once you've been foot treading, the yeasts around the place, and they are everywhere, will start getting hungry. They'll plunge in and they will start fermenting the must very, very quickly. At about 5 or 6 degrees, and the process is called mutage, you arrest the fermentation by adding grape spirit. The grape spirit in the Douro is weaker than elsewhere. It's only 77% ABV. 96% ABV, alcohol by volume, is considered absolute alcohol. You can get a little bit higher, but it's considered absolute alcohol. This slightly weaker grape spirit, which is both slightly flavored, and you can smell it, it has a pungency. When I say slightly flavored, you don't add flavor to it, but because it's not pure grape spirit, you can taste it, you can taste the sappiness of it. And this aguardente, as it's called, is added to the wine whilst it's still fermenting. It arrests fermentation. All the yeasts, all the bacteria, whether they're Brettanomyces, Saccharomyces, various bacteria, Amenococcus, whatever, you'll go, and that's it. It's over for them. Fermentation ceases, leaving a wine of approximately, because it varies slightly according to the house style and what nature gives you, about 100 grams of residual sugar, unfermented sugar, and 20% of alcohol. So you've added approximately 14, 15 degrees of alcohol to the 5 or 6 degrees of natural alcohol. Maturation is in large used wood. Port is not about new wood. It's about larger wood vessels, whether they're vats or tonnelle, large barrels, or the usual large format barrels, which in France might be called a demi-huit, about 550 to about 630 litres. Maturation then begins. This is the important thing. Port needs a rapid and vigorous extraction to give it the legs to last. All port requires the flavor, color, tannin, and extract. What is extract? Extract, the name kind of gives it away. Extract is what you've extracted. It's the dry matter, all those little proteins floating around in the wine. Imagine if you're drinking Amarone, for instance, or Primitivo from southern Italy, or a really full-bodied red wine from the Southern Rhone. You can feel them on the palate, and that's not just tannin from the skins, that's also bits of the skins themselves, and to a degree, some of the pulp. It adds body to the wine. But the challenge with port, and particularly vintage port, is to extract as many of those compounds quickly before the skins are removed and the wine is drained off. This, as you saw from the first photograph, was traditionally done this way. Looks romantic. You do that in a straight line on unbroken berries, it's pretty slippery. And you've all been picking in the vineyard all day. And if you're an honored guest, like you or me, you haven't been in the vineyard, you're smelling lovely and fresh, you've come straight from the shower, had a gin and tonic, then you end up down at the winery and you're next to someone who's been picking grapes for 12 hours. It ain't sweet. But you do this, and then you might do it diagonally, and then crossways, and then, so there isn't a riot and a complete mutiny, the squeeze box comes out, maybe a violin or two, and you have a dance. Another way of doing it, to extract as many of those important compounds, is what Henry Schotten here, the chap on the left, chief winemaker at Graham's, up at Malvedas, What he's doing is using a robotic lagar. And if you look just where my little blinky is, under these doors, can't really see them except the very, very bottom of their feet, the soles of their feet, you have robotic lagar. These are polyurethane covers over little metal feet. What's the advantage of that? It's very unromantic, isn't it? But let's think. People sometimes drink too much, don't turn up in the morning. They sometimes don't turn up at all. They want a pay rise. They get fed up. It's hard to find them in the first place. This is the human condition. We're not completely reliable. A robot will do exactly what you program it to do. And Symington's, whilst not the only people using this system, were certainly the ones who got onto it the soonest and in the biggest way, and they rolled it out. One of the most famous quintas, though, Vesuvio, up in the Douro Superior, doesn't use these. It still uses foot treading. So if ever you go and see them, you'll don the blue shorts and the plaid shirt, and you'll dive into 18 inches or 15 inches of grapes. These are the various styles of port. In essence, there are two styles of port, bottle-aged and wood-aged. It's complicated a bit though. So three main styles: early drinking, bottle-aged, and wood-aged. Early drinking are largely bottle-aged. Early drinking would be ruby, the bottom of the pile. Sometimes these wines are made using red winemaking techniques, such as pumping over. Reserve rubies can be extremely good. And if you taste rubies from little houses like Quinta de la Rosa, for instance, they're very seriously made and actually foot trodden as well. Crusted port, a very, very English affair. Very little crusted port is produced. So a bit like rubies and reserve wines, reserve rubies, these are made from a blend of vintages aged together, and then there's an average that the winemaker considers fit to go into the bottle. But the age of the wine is not stated. Crusted is something similar. You'll take a blend of wines and you'll age them in wood for 3-4 years, and then in bottle for another 3-4 years. It varies according to the house, but crusted port is largely a thing of the past, but it can last. It says early drinking, you can, but you can forget about it too. And crusted port, the name gives it away. It's something that casts a sediment. You then have LBV. This is snapping at the heels of vintage port often. This is a wine from one vintage that is then aged in barrel, usually larger barrels, vats, for the best part of 3 years or so, sometimes longer, and then goes into bottle, but not released for another 2 or 3 years thereafter, depending on the house. And a bit like crusted port, some houses won't filter their LBV, so you actually have to treat it a little bit like a vintage port. So those are the early drinking ports, the affordable ports, if you will, but not necessarily. You then have bottle-aged port, principally vintage port, just 2 years in barrel, one of those pipes that you see here, 550 or so litres, and the grapes will be from the best vineyards, almost always, but not invariably, A-grade vineyards. The rest of the time it spends maturing is in bottle. So after a couple of years in barrel, the wine would have gone into this bottle, and this is from 1980. So the youngest here, that's the good news. But just imagine all the sediment, all the proteins in the wine that would have fallen out in barrel, precipitate in bottle. So port, vintage port, will always have a pretty serious level of, pretty serious amount of sediment. You then have wood-aged port, aged tawnies. Tawnies can be, what, 3, 5, 10, unspecified as 15, but 20 is a specified age, 30, 40, 50. 50-year-old tawnies are usually put into the slightly younger wines like 20s and 30s to really make them interesting. or the 40s rather, to make them interesting. For me, aged tawnies, in terms of value for money, I think 20 years is really where it's at. But in terms of ultimate joy, 50s are spectacular. If you haven't tried Sandeman's 50, well, start saving. And you also have specified harvest tawnies. So tawnies that instead of being an average of 5 years, or this vat blended in with that, they're from 1 year. So this barrel and that barrel are the same age, and they may be blended together or not, and you end up with a collieta. Wood aging is very important in the Douro, this slow oxidative maturation. Least important with those really good value wines, with the rubies and the reserve rubies and some of the LBVs. But if you look at this photograph down the bottom on the left, you see these small barrels. This is at Quinta de la Rosa. These are pipes. And in years gone by, it still exists fairly informally. I remember selling the odd half pipe of wine before, but if you were a generous godfather or a generous godparent or a generous parent, you would buy your children when they were born, or from the vintage nearest to their birth year, a pipe of port. And a pipe holds between 550 and 630 litres. That's a generous present. So just think, that's litres. Turn that into 75 cl bottles and you have more or less the answer, which is why in years gone by, many people drank the same port at home, year in, year out. And certainly when I joined the trade, I noticed a lot of the proceeds of people's birth years were being sold because they didn't want to drink the same port the whole time. Pipes are used to gently mature better wines, such as vintage port. The much larger casks, and you can see them in the back of the photograph, look like a giant port pipe. These are called tonneaux. And tonneaux are effectively a large barrel. They might be 25 times the size of a pipe. On the right-hand side, you see something altogether different. This is a vat. These are huge. I mean, these are like port jacuzzis. You could go for a lovely swim in one of those. Your feet wouldn't touch the bottom. And with these, you age the wines that need less oxygen, earlier release, fruitier styles of port, such as ruby, reserve ruby, LBV. There's less contact with oxygen because the ratio or the relationship between the wood allowing oxygen through and the port is that much smaller. So that's wood aging, pipes, tonneau, and vats. I think enough of the L'Oreal science bit, and actually important to get on to the tasting. The good news is this is the youngest wine on the tasting. This is 1980 War. Let me tell you a little bit about the season. This was an unsettled growing season with extremes of temperature and a fair amount of rain for the first 3 months. Only for the first 3 months of the year, only fell on the 20th of September, and the harvest began just a few days later. So 3 months without rain, then rain, just a little bit, not enough to bloat the thirsty berries, and then the harvest began. It was well-timed rain that cheered up the grapes and made the producers much less nervous. At the time, 1980, following on the coattails, I suppose, of the excellent 1977s, and later, retrospectively compared to 83s and 85s, was considered rather expensive. A little bit like 97 Bordeaux. Nothing wrong with it at all, but considered too expensive at the time. Actually, very good. Now, I would say that 1980 War, or 1980 Port full stop, a bit like 1970, has been vastly underrated. And I think 1980 is catching up with the 77s very nicely indeed. It's a really fine vintage port, and I may be shot down in flames by members of the Taylor Fonseca team or the Symington family, but I think that 80s, in terms of their long legs, will last at least as long as the 77s that got so much more plaudits. So the combination of near perfect growing season, a dry season, some rain, not enough to bloat and split the berries, and temperate weather during the harvest, so it cooled down, made for a really excellent vintage that now, I would say, in the last 10 years, we're really recognizing as a great vintage and a full declaration. So Walls is the oldest continuously owned British port brand. And I think one of the oldest British brands, full stop, 1670, when Charles II was on the throne. This is from Quinta da Cavadinha and Quinta do Retiro. It was bought Quinta da Cavadinha, the mainstay of War, was bought by the Symington family in 1980, and in 2006, another major part of the component, Retiro, was bought. Let's have a look at Cavadinha. It's rather pretty, isn't it? Have you seen they have robotic lagar there as well? Anyway, have a go at that. I don't have a spittoon. I am the spittoon. Look at the color. I'd like you to note the color of these wines as you go along. This, being the youngest wine, a stripling at 40 years, is still pretty red, showing a ruby turning garnet robe and showing that slightly watery rim of an aging, maturing wine, but still fiery and youthful. A wine, I think, with very long legs, meaning I think it's going to last an awfully long time. This is a very exciting wine to talk about. And those of you who've been lucky enough in the past to be members of traditional clubs, I must resist the temptation to use something more colloquial, but traditional clubs like my own, the East India Club, I remember sitting down with a colleague of mine at Berry Brothers and Rudd whilst I was there, and we thought it was a great idea, after getting above ourselves over dinner, to have a bottle of 77 Fonseca. It wasn't that long ago, and it cost £32 a bottle. I wish I bought some. I wish I'd bought some, because every time I taste it, and I think of the 77s, which to a degree nowadays are showing, in some cases, not all, some signs of age, I think 77 Fonseca is utterly spectacular. So I think consistently the pick of the 77s, and the color, a little bit more faded than the previous wine. Really complex, well structured, a wonderful balance. It's grippy, pretty firm. The best 77s still show great freshness. I think Graham's 77 is spectacular. Taylor's 77 is very good indeed. They show concentration and great cellaring potential. So the winter before the harvest, 76, 77, and 76 have been very, very warm throughout the Northwestern Hemisphere, was one of the wettest on record. And a huge amount of rain fell between the year before, October, and March 77. And after a couple of years of drought, this was extremely welcome. The harvest started at a fairly normal time, towards the end of September, maybe a little bit later than usual. And yields in the valley were generally on the high side. There was lots of water in the aquifers, lots of water in the soil. And the Douro is schistous, which is a metamorphic rock, a bit like gneiss on the Danube in places like the Wachau. That is another metamorphic rock. It's on its way over millions and millions of years to becoming something else. The same with schist. It holds water pretty well in this unabatingly hot in summer, dry countryside. So this is mainly from Quinta do Panascal, which is in a river valley on the south side of the Douro. And in undeclared vintages, the proceeds of Fonseca are called Guimarães. So in not fully declared vintages, but in vintages where they want to produce a single quinta, where they want to produce something that represents all that's good about their production, it'll be from Panascal, they'll call it Quinta do Panascal. A bit like the single Quinta of Graham's is Malvedos. So Panascal serves as a single Quinta in vintages that are not universally declared, or not even partially declared, but where Fonseca think they've done a really good job. And in 77, vintage was declared by all the major port houses. I think if you missed this, you would have been in trouble, because it's such a spectacular vintage and has long been lauded as one of the vintages in the last 50 years, much sadly to the detriment of 1980. But watch this space. I think 80 is snapping at its heels. I still think, though, in absolute quality, some of the wines, this one, of 77, are where it's at. Have a go at that. '67 have done a great job of sending these wines out in good time. And I want to talk very briefly about vintage port, because once you've decanted vintage port, again, some people will disagree with me. This is my own belief, but I would say that with older vintage port, they don't hold together in the decanter as well as you might imagine. Certainly much, much better than a red wine. They have sugar, concentration, and high alcohol, and they can last for a number of days. However, if you want them in their pristine state, if you want them as good as they can be, drink them within a couple of days. It's no great hardship. I would say if you can't get through a bottle of port in 2 days, particularly with friends, there's a problem. You can even do it on your own. I wouldn't advise it though. What did you think of that? Please tell me at the end. I think that is superb. And for those of you who've got some, don't be in a hurry to drink it. But if you're worried about drinking it too young, I think it's at its absolute apogee right now and has been for a while, and it shows no sign of moving. I've been drinking this particular wine for, and enjoying it for the best part of 20 years, and it's moved very, very slowly, imperceptibly so. The color has changed a bit. I notice the spirit a little bit more, but the fruit is still has elements of primary fruit about it, but also lovely tertiary dried fruit, fig, date, raisin coming into the fray. It's a very slightly out of focus photograph of Panascal and its surrounding vineyards. That really is very beautiful, isn't it? Look how arid it is there, and look how white the soil is. This is a way of ripening, late ripening grapes. When you have grapes like Suzao and Tintacao and Touriga Nacional, fairly late ripening grapes, having this pale schistous soil reflecting heat back into the canopy of the vines, well, it's a wonderful match, isn't it? This is one of those vintages that I also think, along with 1980, maybe there's something in the zero, 1960 perhaps doesn't back it up so well, nor does 1950, but 1970, I think to a degree, was slightly muted, slightly underrated at the time. People knew it was good, they knew it was very good. I think increasingly people realize that a bit like Fonseca 77, there are certain houses in 70 that created something utterly sublime. So if 1970 was the last vintage to be bottled in Portugal and the UK together, the 75, which we haven't got here today, and across the board not as good as 70, the 75 was the first to be bottled entirely in Portugal at Vila Nova de Gaia. So this one was bottled at the Graham's Lodge at Vila Nova de Gaia, and if you haven't been, go. It's very enthusiast and tourist friendly. And when you're down in Vila Nova or you're across the river into Porto, particularly if you're like me and you love seafood, it's very, very good eating. So the heart of Graham is Quinta dos Malvedos. Remember that photograph I showed you at the beginning? That is the the Symingtons' house, their retreat on the estate. And that with the view photograph I showed you with a few puffs of cloud in the background hangs over the winery. And Henry Schotten, the chap I mentioned with his robotic lagar, that's all Malvedos. And that's where the heart of this wine comes from, including Quinta da Vila Velha and Vada Maladas. So this particular wine, including components such as Quinta da Tua as well in later vintages, and Quinta das Lajes. This is a wine made from multiple components, but the heart of it is from the estate of Malvedos. 70. It was a wet winter, a very cold, gloomy early spring, which pulled itself together, and there was good flowering. There was some rain, refreshing rain rather than heavy rain, in August and September, just to top up the aquifers. And with the harvest commencing round about the right time in the third week of September, in very hot weather, we had almost perfect conditions. And even better, during the harvest, the weather got a little bit cooler. Better for the grapes, better for the harvesters, better for handling the musts. And remember, 1970, even though, well, sadly I remember it, I was very little, but I'm sure some of you remember it, it seems not so long ago. Well, it's 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, things were done differently, much more manually, and without the mod cons that we have now. So no robotic lagars, no air conditioning, and none of the ability to chill musts as we have now in the wine world. 1970, one of the all-time great port vintages, and I think this one, and I wrote this a few days ago, and I still believe it, having tasted it, is arguably the wine of the vintage and still going strong. Sorry, I'm making revolting, percolating port noises. Tell me what you think about that at the end as well. I think it's spectacular. And we're now getting into wines of some maturity. If I had to define the 70 though, it's about fruitcake, fig, date, raisin. Do you remember the taste of Boal, the taste of Malvasia that we were tasting the other day, or at another time in your drinking experience? This is similar, lower acidity than those Madeiras, but certainly has that fruitcake capacity to it. Really delicious, thick, glutinous, rich, ripe, very expensive on the palate, lots of tannin, good acidity. This is a wine with 100 grams or thereabouts residual sugar, 20% alcohol. You feel the burn as it goes down, but it's all so well balanced, so well packaged. How many other wines can do this at 50 years of age? It's really quite spectacular, particularly when you consider the price, which doesn't hurt too much. Look around. Here are the fortification vats at Malvedos. And these large vats are where the fermenting must at 5 or 6 degrees alcohol and the aguardente are introduced to each other, or rather where they're harmonized with each other. And different houses will have different ways of introducing them, but these old fortification musts still do the job at Malvedos. And here is a way of harmonizing the additional grape spirit into the wine and keeping them together before aging them in pipes. And you can see pipes on the right-hand side of the photograph, just over here, of Richard Girling here. Oh, and for those of you who knew him, this is the late, great Ed Burns, sadly now no longer with us, but a very great port enthusiast. Gosh, 1966 Taylor. And just like when you look at a 1960s movie and you look at the cars and think, my goodness, those look old-fashioned. Well, I think of 1966 as being quite recent. It's my birth year, and it was quite a long time ago, wasn't it? Let's face it. 1966 was another one of those vintages that are excellent now in our recognition, but overshadowed by the rather more homogeneous, the more universally good 1963s, but hitting some of the same heights. If I had to characterize 66 over 63, I would say 66s are generally a little bit leaner, but they have a slightly more attenuated, lengthy acidity. You notice the acidity, the freshness, a little bit more than the 63s. 63 has more in common with 70, I think, in terms of its body, its build, its voluptuousness. There's nothing voluptuous about this wine. Very beautiful, but built rather differently. I think I need to steer away from these metaphors in case I get into French winemaker territory. So this is turning out to be a very special wine, a very special vintage indeed, showing remarkable freshness and structure. One of the wettest winters preceding the vintage, so the winter of 65 and spring of 66 were extremely wet. Later spring was warm, a dry summer with high temperatures, and in the Cima Corgo, getting up into the mid-40s. That's pretty hot, isn't it? 44, 45 by the beginning of September. Temperatures cooled as the vintage progressed, and plenty of groundwater, a bit like the 77s, managed to hold the harvest together without raisening of the grapes. The grapes weren't unduly stressed. They were stressed to the degree that we would like grapes to be stressed, but when they're overly stressed and you get raisening, you end up with rather tertiary flavors. You end up with rather seaweedy flavors in the wine far too soon. So the heart of Taylor's port is the fruit from Quinta do Vargelas in Pinhão, in the Cima Corgo, as well as from the very historic, and it was producing wine back when the Douro zone in 1756 was being demarcated. It was a productive quinta back then. And also, that was Quinta de Terra Feita. I'm going to show you a photograph. And more recently, but not in this particular wine, Quinta do Junco. That's Terra Feita at the top, and that's Vargelas at the bottom. This is taken in the height of summer. Certainly the bottom photograph it looks hot, doesn't it? Those olive trees, they look parched. So we have, if I can just explain some of the vineyards. A-grade vineyards are generally those with the more advantageous aspects. They won't be down right by the river, unlikely to be. They're going to be away from the humidity of the river. They probably won't be necessarily very top slope, but they'll be in the place where there's the greatest balance of water retention, aspect to the sun, nutritional value. And it depends according to the vineyard, because this is a real patchwork, as you can see. What did you think of that? Let's have a quick go at that. After the 70, this is a very different wine indeed. A completely different color, much more garnet, a sort of mid-garnet color. It's not opaque, you can see through it. Relatively pale compared even to the 1970 grain, and very pale compared to the 80 war. So that's the 66, and that's the 80. Probably difficult to look at on film footage like this. So 66 from the excellent house of Taylor's, and from a really good vintage that was slightly underrated because it had the misfortune to arrive, to be born between 1963 and 1970. 1970 had the misfortune to be on the market when 1977 was around. And 1980 also had that misfortune after 1977. So it depends which way you look at it. Sometimes a great vintage before can kind of overshadow you, or a great vintage after, or being sandwiched between two really good vintages, like this one, between the 63 and the 1970, you get overlooked. You end up, to a degree, being a little bit of the Cinderella of the ball. Nowadays, we know what Cinderella really looks like, and this is spectacular. Just a few words on developments relevant to vintage port. I just mentioned very briefly, just glanced upon difficulties with labour. And this isn't a problem that's unique to the Douro. It's everywhere in Europe, even in those countries where much of the labour comes from, such as Romania, for instance. It's not easy getting people onto the land. In most of Western Europe, and let's not count Southern Europe not as Western Europe, in most of Western Europe, getting hold of labour is hard. And it has been for quite a long time because of EU regulation, because naturally people over the last, God knows how many years, depending on which country they come from, have been leaving the villages and going to the cities, seeking a different life, a life that is less arduous. And it hasn't finished yet, it's still going on. So difficulties with labour, that's one. A diminished market. How many of us drink port? Well, everyone present does. How many people out in the marketplace drink port? And how much port are they actually drinking? They may say, yeah, I drink port. They probably drink one bottle a year when they answer affirmatively to the question. So it's a diminished market. The good news is, look down the very bottom, quality has never been better. It's superb. Light wine is on the rise. So if you're a fan of Crisser, that Symington Pratt's joint venture, if you're a fan of the light wine of Vesuvio, if you're a fan of the wines of Quinta de la Rosa, the Du Rosa or the La Rosa, and many others besides, you'll know all about these light wines, to a degree taking up the slack of the market, because there's only so much port that people drink nowadays. And this is a problem that's universal. Fortified sweet wine and fortified wine. So, let me go back. More wine is matured up in the Douro. Till recently, the great majority of wine was being matured down in Villanova de Gaia. That's where the trade routes were. That's where the wine could be aged under one roof. But more and more producers are not just experimenting, but committing to maturing their wines up in the Douro. There's improved technology. Look at those robotic regards. That's just one aspect. There's improved access as well. Climate change. Climate change has taken its toll, but it's also made winemakers and viticulturists look at the grapes they're using. Is Tinto Roriz the right grape? Should we have so much Tinto Cao? Do we need more Suzanne? Should we have maybe a little bit more of Touriga Nacional? So a focus on long lost varieties is taking place, and also a focus on the terracing, or the style of terracing that is most cost effective. There are more top quality vintages being declared. So not necessarily more vintages being declared, more top quality vintages being declared. This is because of improved viticulture, improved winemaking, and also being, to a degree, a net beneficiary of climate change. But it's difficult. More major weather events and unpredictable weather. Quality has never been better. Oh, I went in the wrong direction. Almost there, the penultimate wine. So, not every day you get to taste 63s, is it? Or indeed 66s, or indeed 1970s, or 77s, or even 80s. But for many of us, tasting any 63, particularly Taylor 63, which was one of the choice picks of the vintage, is a real treat. So a really, really cold winter. Some of the coldest temperatures recorded in living memory. There was a cool spring and a relatively cool but dry summer, with just a couple of stretches of warm spells. All in all, not the most prepossessing vintage. Harvest began quite late, as you'd imagine, at Vargelis on the 7th of October. But sufficient sunlight, a lack of excessive heat, and sufficient groundwater created this near perfect growing season. This temperate weather during harvest, so warm but not hot, made for a benchmark vintage and a full or universal declaration. And this is the benchmark, you've probably heard this before, against which other ports, other vintage ports are compared. And it's a legendary vintage. I remember in slightly more privileged days, doing what I was doing at BBR, comparing this to 45s and 48s and 55s and 63. It brings to mind Blackadder and Captain Darling drinking Chateau Lafitte whilst thousands of British and enemy soldiers were being machine gunned by both sides. So comparing 63 to a 55, gosh, that really is a mug's game. But 63 is the vintage, certainly in living memory, by which all other vintages are compared, because it was so homogeneous, excellent uniformity of character, and a wine that is full and generous and delicious. Have a go. The spirit back in those days, and forgive me, port producers watching, I would hazard a guess, was slightly more, well, slightly iffy compared to aguardente being produced today, because part of the joy of tasting old port, did I say Madeira? I hope I didn't. Part of the joy of tasting old port is that bite, is that slightly green, sappy flavour from the less than excellent aguardente being produced at the time. And it does produce a certain amount of refreshment on the palate, a certain amount of, I suppose, aggression on the palate that with tannin and balanced by sugar, but with the alcoholic fieriness, creates a wine that is very vivid, a wine that is slow to age, very youthful, that announces its presence. I think 63s are very slightly lighter weight than 1970s, slightly more refreshment, but a similar build, if you will. Wines that are full, velvety, generous. You're probably thinking he hasn't been spitting enough. But if I was describing the tannins, they are fine-grained and velvety. The final wine, I think, is a real treat. And I just wanted to show you what a 63 vintage port, the color, and a 1963 single harvest or colheita tawny port taste like next to each other. Because that's quite figgy, quite raisiny, still has some primary fruit, but is a big wine with a fair amount of extract, but very, very elegant. Now look at this wine. There's Vargelis from the other side that we saw earlier, looking downriver. The color of that really is a tawny color, isn't it? A tawny port color, which of course it is. And it smells very different. It smells, to me, it has slightly more of that lovely Doru Bake character. Doru Bake can be negative. I think it can be also positive. It has a fruitcake character. It has something slightly seaweedy and medicinal, almost carbolic. So this was made, and this is at the Graham's Lodge at Villanova de Gaia. And those are pipes of port aging. And some of those pipes may have held, in the past, this. Made from grapes grown at Malvedas, up in the Cima Corco, and also at Quinta das Lajes in a tributary of the Douro, the Rio Torto. And this was aged in seasoned wood, remember, not new wood, down here at Vila Nova de Gaia for more than 50 years. So whilst that last wine spent the great majority of its life in bottle, just 2 years in barrel, this spent hardly any time in bottle. And there is the bottle up there. Hardly spent any time in bottle whatsoever. This was bottled recently, and as a result, it's lost a lot more of its color in barrel. There's anthocyanins, there's color pigments, and a lot of the tannins have fallen out of sediment in barrel. This is a wine that doesn't need decanting except for the sole purposes of waking it up and showing off your glassware. Do tell me what you think of that. I think this is quite spectacular. This is much richer, much more fruitcake in its character than the previous wine. The previous wines were rather more vinous, or rather more wine-like in character. This smells and tastes like an oxidized wine, which of course it is. These wines are not cheap, but they're extremely good value when you compare them to other wines of similar note. Roland, I think we're done. I think it's time. Is that okay? What time is it?
We're 4 minutes past, but you're very interesting to listen to, so that's fine. Don't worry if we go over time.
Should we have some questions?
Absolutely.
I'll stop sharing. And before we go any further, we're looking at Porto, and this is from Cavadinha, one of the Wars quintas, and this is an old barca, really used for sort of touristic show purposes. I just dread to imagine what it was like barreling down, quite literally, covered in barrels, stacked 3 deep, down the Douro with the currents, and not always being able to avoid the rocks. Must have been pretty scary and needed a lot of skill. Let's do some Q&A. Why? So this is Takanori Sasaki. Why are vintages or vintage wines deeply colored, more structured and full-bodied compared with blending? Well, they're all blended. They're all blended wines. Compared with, when you say blended, I think you mean ruby, reserve ruby. Let me just move that so I can see. Hello. Reserve ruby wines are paler in color because they don't really go through the same extraction process. They don't go through the process, on the whole, of foot treading and robotic legage. The Bergquists of Quinta de la Rosa do differently. They do foot treading, and their wines are quite deep. But if you use red winemaking techniques for making junior ports, early drinking ports, you don't end up with so much color. I hope that answers your question, because vintage port goes through an awful lot of extraction of color, flavor, tannin, you name it. Friedrich Elving, what are the main differences in style between the major houses and their vintage port over time? Good question. I would say in the slightly more austere, particularly in youth camp, we have Dow's. And Dow's actually is a little bit drier than the majority of other ports. The fermentation goes on a little bit longer, and you might have 5, 7, 8 grams, or sometimes more, of residual sugar. You might have a little bit less of that residual sugar. Tailors, I think, can sometimes be pretty structured and statuesque. Wines that age very, very slowly. Wars too. The more generous style of the top tier are Graham's and Fonseca. But don't only look at those. Look at Smith Woodhouse, Calls Harris. Look at Calem, Ramos Pinto. They all have something to offer in certain vintages. And I think the last two, Calem and Ramos Pinto, usually for me are a slightly lighter style. but Calls Harris, Smith Woodhouse, and others often get overlooked because they're a little bit cheaper and they're a slightly more affordable proposition, but they're very, very serious wines that last for decades and show that all that's good about vintage port. Gould Campbell 77 is one of the good ones. Yes, Frederick, that's from you as well. A really good wine, and I think Gould Campbell is another one of those houses that I think is of great note. And 80 is particularly good too. Yes, I have. Have I tasted any 27 recently? And they're still going strong. I wish I could taste more 1927 port. Frederick, I'll come around your house and we'll drink some together. So 27 was a full, generous style of port. And I was lucky enough to join BBR back in the day when there was plenty, and I contributed to its untimely demise. Oh dear. Do I prefer English or Portuguese bottled 1970 ports? It's difficult to say, but I think the English were perhaps better at it because they had more experience. One of these has been bottled, that's 1963, was bottled by Corney and Barrow. I think the 66, I'm not sure, I think it was bottled by BBR. But merchants in the UK had an awful lot of experience at bottling port, an awful lot, whether it was down here, Bristol, up in Edinburgh, they were very experienced at it. Hello, Peter. Why has port become less popular? Not for me, nor for me, Peter. It's become less popular because of the way we live, the way we eat and drink. Just like you, being in the finance world, when you started, you probably went out for lunch for 3 hours. That's changed, and you didn't drink, you probably drank port at lunchtime. This is why you joined the wine trade, so you still can. But port has become less popular because of the way we live, and the way we eat, and the way we drink, and the pressures of life. You can certainly drink port in the evenings. Drinking port at lunchtime, if you intend to go back to work, unless you're a wine merchant, is probably not the best idea. I hope that answers your question. Anyway, let's do just that soon, Peter. Is that correct? 20, 30, etc. Old Tawny isn't as old, meaning it tastes like the declared age. So Tawnies, Peter Douglas, are an average age, and you get some very old Tawnies. The oldest Tawnies are Collietas, some from the 19th century, and they are declared vintages of Tawny, declared harvests. But if you taste Sandeman's 50, that is quite spectacular. These are wines that are spent so long in barrel, and remember, they're spending so long in barrel, which means the angels are getting an awful lot of their share. When a wine goes into bottle, the evaporation is very, very slow. In barrel, it's quite rapid, a few percent a year, which is pretty unfair on the port producers, lucky angels. But 20, I think, is a spectacular average age, with some older components, some younger components, and William Pickering by BBR is a 20-year-old, one of the best on the market, extremely affordable, and it's just everything you want a tawny port to be, and it doesn't break the bank. 30s, on the whole, they can be a little bit up and down, as can 40s. I'm lucky enough, along with Richard Mason and others, to judge these wines, and 20s I found to be more consistent. The highest heights of 30s and 40s are higher, and 50s, the blending components for 30s and 40s, let's say 40s, are spectacular, but very few and far between. Anonymous attendee, regarding the market, do you happen to have an idea what proportion of the sizable port and Madeira export to France end up in saucepans rather than glasses? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm afraid that exports of port and Madeira to France are decreasing, and exports of port and Madeira at the top end to the UK are coming back up again. So we're drinking better, but in terms of France, I'm afraid there's perhaps a fair amount of saucepanage. Now, Alex Bridgman. Thank you for your kind words. If you're drinking a vintage port purely for enjoyment, what age of port would you choose? 30 years, 1990, 40, 50. I'm very lucky. I'm in the wine trade like you, Alex, and so I like them older. I would say anything from 1980, which I still consider pretty young. I think 85, for me, it may sound a little bit overprivileged, are still a little bit young to drink. Buy them, drink them, hold on to some of them. 80s, the same. 77s, I think, by and large need drinking, but there's some spectacular ones like Graham's and Fonseca and Taylor's, that, and others too, but I just think Fonseca is the spectacular 77. If you're looking at 75s, drink them up. If you're looking at 70s, no hurry. If you're looking at 66s, actually no hurry. 63, no hurry. 60s, they need drinking, but they're delicious. They don't need drinking today or next year or the year after, but you should think about it. If you've got some serious 55s like Noval Nacional, invite me around to your house, please. But they are wonderful. Same with 45s, 48s as well. Why is there much less bite heat from Aguardent in 63 Colheita than the 63 Taylor? From time, very good question, from time in wood. It's just the effects of oxidation have harmonized the wine. They've evaporated quite a lot of the spirit. Cross-blending between different barrels has created a wine that is lovely and figgy and fruitcakey. Whereas the 63, remember, spent the great majority of its life in bottle, a very, very different maturation vessel, almost inert. The only thing that oxygen passes through in a bottle is the cork. Mark Swift, how does the size of the Douro area compare in size to, say, Burgundy or Bordeaux? Smaller than both, but not much smaller than Burgundy. A lot smaller than Bordeaux. Remember, Bordeaux produces a quarter of France's wine every year. So the Douro is pretty small. But it isn't just the size of the Douro, it's the fact it produces so little. It's the yields are very, very low. Bruna, hello. Could you please explain more about vineyard grades? Top grades, A and B. I think it goes down to F. This is something that consumers don't generally get to hear about, don't need to know about, because most of the stuff you drink, Bruna, if it's the Bruna, I think it is, the vineyard grades in the wines we've been drinking are top grade, A and B. I hope that answers your question. Mark again. I notice that some houses are generally sweeter than others, irrespective of age. Is there a difference in general between sugar in the houses? No, not much. It's a perspective. And also, it's a case of vintage as well. So some vintages have more acidity, which effectively buffers the perception of sweetness. I hope that answers your question. With the diminishing market, does that make investment in newer vintages a better or worse idea? I'm not sure that investing in port is going to net you as much return if you want your wine to be positive in potential. It will be with port, but you're better off with something rather more liquid as an asset, forgive the pun, like Bordeaux, which is more tradable. But yes, great vintages like 11, 7, but particularly 11 Dow were just snapped up very, very quickly, and they've gone like that. So yeah, it can be a good investment vehicle, albeit a very unofficial one. Matt, with the diminishing market, does that make investment in newer vintage? Sorry, I just read that one. Amy, you indicated earlier that port is best, not port, vintage port. Yeah, vintage port's best within 2 days of opening. Older ones are. Since it comes in rather large bottles, is there a good way to rebottle or keep it in smaller containers to have it last longer? My husband isn't really a port drinker. I love it. It's so often the other way around. I'm delighted to hear this. Well done, Amy. That's good news. The answer is buy half bottles or buy a Coravin, train husband, perhaps get some friends round. It can last more than 2 days. If it's an 85, 91, 92, 94, 97, if you're delving into those, I think the latter ones, in my book, are too young, but we're all different in what we appreciate. I would say younger wines can last longer, open, because they lose less more immediately. But I think that 63 Taylors, if you left it another day or two, it'll still be delicious, but you're just missing some of the story. Peter, what do you like to eat with an aged vintage port, if anything? I think, remember the other day I was talking about Madeira. I think ports are best with sweeter things, in my view, other than cheese. So almost any cheese and vintage port, particularly mature port, and remember the maturity of the port and the food matches, it matters a great deal. If you're tasting this lovely old 63 Colheita, then it'll go with almost anything, whether it's delicate or very in your face and vivid. But I think if you're drinking, if you're having a lovely consommé, I was discussing this with Ronan earlier, Cercial, I think, would be better than this Colheita, but the Colheita will still work well. If you're like me, I love making chicken soup, then I think this Colheita would work very well. Vintage port, though, I think, is something for red and black berried puddings and desserts, for old-fashioned steamed puddings, things that contain suet, for instance, proper old-fashioned sponges, chocolate. Who out there doesn't like chocolate? Chocolate and vintage port and tawny port is a match made in the higher realms of heaven, and nearly all cheeses. Peter, I hope that answers your question. Kathleen, what about the 83s? I like 83s, particularly 83 Croft. I have had a wonderful colleague, still a wonderful friend, a chap called Lance Jefferson. Some of you will know him. And he always referred to 83s, because they're lighter in body, as being a lunchtime port. And actually, they're just as high in sugar and alcohol, but they have slightly less extract. They don't make you feel quite as squiffy as those fuller bodied wines. 83s, in terms of the pantheon of quality, they're up there, but not at the top. They're like 75s. They're really delicious, but they're just not. They don't have the legs of 70, 77, 80, and other very fine vintages, nor of course the 63 or 66. Peter, Douglas, could you do a Commanderia wine or other quite unknown fortified webinar? Oh, you know me well, being half Cypriot. I would be delighted to talk about Commanderia, one of my favorite topics, particularly the different styles of Commanderia. Commanderia can be fortified and can taste very much like this wonderful 63 Colheita. In fact, the oldest Commanderia I've had was from the 1870s. It had to be dug out with spades and then have 1950 added to it to make it liquid again. I kid you not. So yes, please invite me. Amy, no need to apologize about anything. Be a port newbie. Good question you asked earlier. Get your husband to get more interested in port. It's up to you to evangelize him. Dominic, my friend's father bought half a hogshead of Sandeman 1960 and only consumed a few dozen bottles before he passed. Oh, I'm sorry, before he passed. What advice would you give to my friend now? I thought that was starting quite badly, but then I understand the reason now. This is a very common story. This happens to many, many people. I would say he should sell some of it and hang on to some of it. There will be takers out in the market who would love to drink that because it's still going strong. I like 1960s. They're not the best vintage, but they're a very long-lived vintage and delicious. I've got some 60 war, I think, and 60 now. Really, it's a nice vintage, but all over the place in terms of quality. I haven't tasted the Sandeman for a while. So sell some, keep some. Don't sell everything. You'll always regret it. Bruno, hello, Demetri. Actually, I was thinking about the differences between an A vineyard and an F vineyard. Why port uses A and light wines don't. No, light wines don't. Light wines have a much more homogeneous view of the vineyard. But you'd imagine that with fortified wine production, that quality could be ameliorated by the addition of grape spirit. But port wine, best port wines, as far as I'm aware, only made from the A and B quality vineyards. I don't know the answer beyond that. I should, but I don't. Email me and I'll find out in the meantime. Where to buy the actual older vintages, like 60s and 70s, BBR, BBEX, or in the 80s. They are, you're right, didn't used to be, but they are now, because they're finite in terms of supply. Let me tell you. Try looking on Wine Searcher. Fine and Rare, I think, do some. MWH, look on Wine Searcher. Wilkinson Vintners, because I had to look into this. Seckfords, and you'll find some provincial, that sounded a bit pompous, didn't it? Some sort of country merchants who also have good lists, because they haven't got the London weight of drinkers drawing all their good stuff out. So I would look at maybe people like, gosh, I've got a mental blank. Can't think off the top of my head, but look online, look on Wine Searcher. But Bruno, I hope I answered your question as well. Where to buy the actual vintages? I've done that, Daniel. Frederick, what other recent vintages could you buy now for aging? 85s are drinking now, but you can age them. 91, 92 are very hard to find. 94 is superb. 97 is superb. I would go for 2000s. 03, not my particular style, but there's some very good ones. 7 is excellent. You see the number of excellent vintages in recent years. 11, if you can find it, a bit expensive now, but off the scale, up there in 1963. And 16 and 17, both very, very good. Buy those recent vintages. One of my favorite producers for the late 50s, Noval and Noval National, absolutely. Graham, Taylor, War, Dow. 55 is the standout vintage. I've had some other less universally declared vintages, but 55 is the one to go for. And the early 80s, 1980, 1985, those are the two really good ones. 80, I think, being better than 85 on the whole, but also 83 if you want a lighter style. I think that's it. I hope I answered everyone's questions. Ronan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again. Fantastic.
My pleasure.
So we're looking forward to seeing you coming back to do Mediterranean wines.
Yes, Eastern Med wines. So we're going from Sicily via Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, Lebanon, and alighting in Israel.
Great. And I think you need to come back for Commandaria as well.
Oh, please. Yeah. How about Commandaria and other medieval wines of the Eastern Med? Yeah,
that's a good subject. That's a great subject.
Well, thank you very, very much for listening wherever you are, and a glass of wine with you. Cheers all. Thank you very much.